On today's World Insight with Jian Wei, a new round of tit-for-tat tariffs between China and the U.S. bodes well for upcoming trade talks, and a U.S. retail giant makes a big splash on the opening day of its first China store despite trade tensions. Here's our host, Jian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin today's show with the ongoing China-U.S. trade war. A fresh wave of tariffs have gone into effect starting Sunday between the world's two largest economies. China has lodged a case against the United States with the World Trade Organization over U.S. import duties. The Chinese Commerce Ministry says the latest tariffs violate the consensus reached by leaders of China and the U.S. in late June. The ministry says China will firmly defend its legal rights under WTO rules. It says it is taking actions to protect the multilateral trading system. The tariffs come a week after President Trump ordered American companies to break off ties with China and to what he called bring jobs back to the U.S. Will they really? Take a look.
Mr. Trump gave a directive that conflicts with the plans of a vast majority of large U.S. firms doing business in China. That's according to a new survey of U.S.-China Business Council members. 87% of respondents said they have neither moved nor plan to move operations out of China, compared with 90% in a 2018 survey. Both countries are pressing ahead with new tariffs. On September 1st, Washington slapped a new 15% tariff on $300 billion worth of Chinese goods. The taxes will be imposed in two stages. First, on smartwatches, TVs, footwear, and other goods. A second, on cell phones, laptops, toys, and clothing, starting December 15. In retaliation, China unveiled extra tariffs on $75 billion of U.S. goods, which will be imposed in two installments, the exact same dates that the U.S. tariffs take effect. Trade between the world's two largest economies has slumped, and China, which had long been America's biggest trading partner, dropped to third place in the first half of the year, behind Mexico and Canada. Negotiators from both countries plan to meet again early this month in the U.S., but the Chinese Ministry of Commerce says the new round of U.S. tariffs does not bode well for talks. China hopes the U.S. can return to normal bilateral trade rather than adding fuel to the fire of tensions.
On the spiraling trade tensions between China and the United States, in New York City, we have Robert Hormat, Vice Chairman of Kissinger Associates, also former Undersecretary of State for Economic Business and Agricultural Affairs from the U.S. Also in United States, join us in the New York City, we have Anthony Chen, who is a former J.P. Morgan Chase chief economist. Meanwhile, joining us in our Beijing studio, Zhao Hai, Senior Research Fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to start by asking Mr. Hormat. So, what we are seeing, the increasing tension between the two countries by further tariffs against one another. This is just one more step. Are we going to see more to come?
Well, that depends on what happens in these conversations or talks in September. I think that if they are established as a way of dealing with the problems or making progress toward dealing with a wide range of problems, it's entirely possible that both sides will decide not to impose the additional tariffs that have been threatened or announced. So there's always a possibility that that will not happen, that those tariffs won't be imposed. On the other hand, if the talks don't go well, then the probability is that we will see the imposition of those additional tariffs. So we're really at a point that will determine whether they go forward or whether they can be held off for a period of time.
But to you, looking at the temperature, it seems both sides try to put in front of the public. What do you think about the possibilities, Mr. Hormat, very briefly? Would you say 80% likely to have some kinds of progress or much less?
I wish I were more optimistic about progress. I think that the tone of the relationship, and particularly after some kind of understanding was reached on a truce between President Trump and President Xi, the fact that the United States, even after that truce had been announced, the United States decided, and President Trump decided to go forward with more tariffs, and of course China has decided it's going to retaliate. The fact that that truce, which hopefully, I thought at the point, would have calmed things down and improved the environment for negotiations, the fact that the United States proceeded without consulting China and proceeded in a way to do something that Chinese perceived as violating that truce, I think has heightened tensions. And then declaring China a currency manipulator also heightened tensions. So if anything, since the truce, tensions have increased, and the probability of a deal, in my judgment, probably, and at least in the near term, has decreased.
Mr. Chen, if you look at the kind of tariffs the two sides try to add toward one another, 250 billion, 25%, now 15% on 111 billion. That's from the U.S. side. From the Chinese side, it seems it's much more restrained, many argue. And meanwhile, Chinese side has been pushing some of the tariffs to be added later only in the year, likely to be December. What does it show and demonstrate about the willingness, in other words, for each of the two sides to talk to the other side?
Well, I think that any time you play a dangerous game of chicken, I think it's important that at least one of the sides realizes that maybe this is getting out of hand. The Chinese, of course, have to move forward and impose some tariffs, because otherwise they lose face. But at the same time, they realize that it's a situation where you can have mass destruction. I know that we obviously import a lot more from China than the Chinese import from us. So people argue that somehow the United States has a stronger position. My argument is that if I were in a gunfight with another person and I'm able to shoot them 4 times, but they're only able to shoot me once, we can still do real damage to each other. And I think that the Chinese realize that, and the U.S. to some extent eventually will get that. So I think that they're trying to lower that temperature. But I agree with Robert that the situation is not at all as optimistic as we would all like it to be.
It's a very American analogy, I have to say, Mr. Chen, you just made about the gun shooting. It's rare in my country, I'm afraid, to have guns. But anyway, Mr. Zhao, going to you. What do you think is the mentality that China is having right now? I mean, it seems that there has been a constant lack of trust from this side toward the negotiation promise made, whether it is behind the closed doors or in front of the public. So what do you think will be the smart strategy from China, particularly from now on?
Well, the Minister of Foreign Affairs said very clearly that the U.S. side needs to create conditions for the resumption of the talks. So far, we've seen times again the United States side, particularly Trump himself, when enraged, make very hasty decisions, escalating this trade war again and again. So without the commitment of a real negotiation, and also moving forward without the concrete terms in which both sides can act on, it's very difficult for Chinese side to trust the Trump administration at this point.
Earlier, Mr. Hormat and Mr. Chen both talk about their look at what is likely to be the real potential. Now, what do you think about the possibilities that the two sides will be able to reach some kinds of agreement, at least consensus, in the near future, particularly with the earlier agreed so-called September talk?
I'm
whether it could go on is one question already.
Yeah, I'm rather pessimistic a bit at this point, because so far the U.S. side hasn't shown any condition-creating attitude. They're not coming down, and they're not rolling back any of the tariffs that's been added. And so far, currency manipulator stays. So I think you can't just serve lip service to go through this process. You need to do real work to show the Chinese side that they're sincere and serious about continuing talks between the two sides.
I see. So if the governments are acting the way that, gentlemen, you just described, and the nature of things as you had just described, let's talk about the businesses. Now, Mr. Hormat, according to the latest survey done American business community and organizations, likely to be 80 to 90% of American businesses that are operating right now in China would like to stay rather than to leave, as argued by the president. Those who want to move to the other countries besides the Chinese market have also been increasing, for example, to 10%, but not dramatic either. So what do you make of this mentality coming up from the American business community, and how is it likely they're going to deal with the reality?
Well, I think you've made a very good point. First of all, let me say that I think the Chinese government has exercised a lot of restraint in the way it has dealt with the fact that the United States has announced the imposition of tariffs on $300 billion worth of Chinese goods. I think the Chinese position is trying to de-escalate the situation and improve the environment for the negotiations. I think that's a very positive element coming from Beijing. The broader point that you make, I think American companies are trying to maintain a good relationship with China. They've developed these trade ties and these investment relationships, personal relationships, joint research relationships over a period of decades. And they worked very closely together with Chinese companies. Of course, there are issues. And those issues are being discussed in the negotiations. But the notion of decoupling or disengagement, this sort of Cold War notion that periodically comes out of Washington, and there's some people, one of the problems in Washington is there's a division even in Washington. Some people want a deal to create a level playing field. Others have the view that we should be decoupling or disengaging from China, reversing the interaction that has been developed over the last couple of decades. American companies don't want that. They want the option of continuing to engage with China, to sell in China, particularly high-tech companies, to utilize Chinese components, and for the president to tell them you have to get out of China or disengage. They don't want that. Moreover, it's not easy to do. It would take a long time to do. It'd be very disruptive to their business and to both economies. And also, most of the disengagement, if the American companies moved out of China, they wouldn't be coming back here. They'd be going to some other part of the world, maybe Vietnam, Myanmar, and perhaps Mexico, but it wouldn't be bringing jobs back to the United States. It would be just shifting them somewhere else. So it doesn't really make much economic sense, and most companies don't like it.
It seems to be quite complicated, the dilemma the American companies are facing right now. Now, earlier in the stages of so-called trade war and conflict, the American companies were pretty much on the side of the Trump administration, arguing for fairer trade and also relationship. But now, since Trump has been arguing, well, you stick with me and we're going to get better. But after almost 2 years, things are not necessarily getting better, but rather even worse. So the American companies apparently are thinking, I'm not sure if I'm still with you. But now, here's the thing, Mr. Zhao. How shall we understand the potential of American businesses in China, or the other way around, which is much worse, I guess, for Chinese businesses in the United States? A lot of problems over there already as a result of policies coming from the U.S. The fate of it, are they going to be caught now in the crossfire of geopolitics, with which they were earlier playing a role in building, or at least adding oil to the fire, to say the least?
I think on the American side, the hawks in the Trump administration want this situation exactly to happen to those companies so that they can squeeze those companies, convince those companies to leave China, or not necessarily moving back to the U.S., but at least move the whole supply chain out of China and give China's economy a very big blow. However, I think the Chinese side, President Xi and other leaders has shown repeatedly that China still welcome American investment and wanted to create a better environment for those companies. And you can see that from the recent polls. So I think it's very clear that the Chinese side acting restrained, not only restrained, but actually thinking long term and thinking beyond this current dispute between the U.S. and China. So I think you have to look at the Trump administration to understand their intentions, because so far I don't see any real loud voice representing the business community in the Trump administration. On the other hand, you have people from the intelligence, military, and hardliners in Washington, D.C. circle advocating decoupling. So I think Trump is gradually and more convinced by this point. So that's why in the beginning he talks about trade deficit, and later on, particularly recently, he only talked about forcing Americans companies out of China.
Right.
So I think you can see a very significant change in his tones, because his strategy is not working.
Well, tones is one thing, tactics is one thing. Whether the strategy has really changed and the purpose has really changed, if there is a purpose, as one would argue, is another thing. Of course, we have to wait and see. On the other hand, Mr. Chan, things are more complicated than just the businesses. We have seen a change of the trend, particularly when it comes to trade and geopolitics. Now, trade is just one thing out of a very complex picture. But if trade is not being handled well, one would argue hardly there could be any parts of the bilateral relationship be handled better. So, Mr. Chan, how do you see the importance of trade now? And will both sides hold dear the understanding of the significance of trade for the potential of the relationship between the two, Mr. Chan?
I think the relationship is very important. Sometimes that gets lost in the details. You got to remember that when you look at the U.S. and China, that's 40% of world global GDP. And you also have to look at the fact that it's also hurting economic growth for both countries. I estimate that this year, Chinese real GDP will probably come in much weaker than otherwise. Next year, I'm looking for Chinese real GDP to be somewhere around 5.8 to 5.9%, which a few years ago would have been inconceivable, but it is slowing down. In the U.S., I look for U.S. real GDP growth to be below 2%, somewhere around 1.8 or 1.9%. So clearly, both sides are being negatively impacted. And when you take two countries that make up 40% of world GDP, you cannot assume that that doesn't have implications on the political front. And that is something that I think can, in fact, reignite the incentives for both countries to come back to the table and basically negotiate in good faith. So even though the outlook is a little darkened by what we've seen in recent weeks, I think the long-term outlook has to be positive because of these realities.
Mr. Hormat, you already see it. I mean, China now is the third largest trading partner of the United States when it comes to export, following Canada and Mexico even. Earlier, it was the largest one. And you also see that other economies, including Japan, South Korea, already suffering in their exports to China, and as a result, in the percentage of the economic growth rate. South Korea, more than 10%. Japan likely to be about 7% in its export to China now. So obviously, there is a speeding up of consequences happening in both Chinese and American economies and economies elsewhere. But still, there is an issue of timing, Mr. Hormat, given the election.
Yes. Before I answer the question, let me just say I completely agree with Anthony's point that China, President Xi, and other Chinese leaders are doing their best to encourage a positive investment environment for foreign companies, including American companies. So because I think they realize it's in China's interest for growth and also for connectivity with the rest of the world. Which brings me to your second point, and that is, you're absolutely right that when you take the two biggest economies in the world, which used to have the biggest trading relationship with the world, now it's diminished a little bit. And those economies slow down in part because of this trade war. Then you have what I call mutually assured disruption, and that is both economies will be disrupted by the trade effects and the supply chain effects and a mistrust on the economic front. But it also affects their trading partners, China's trading partners, America's trading partners in Asia and other parts of the world, because many parts of the world trade with China more than the U.S. So a weak China affects them, and that adversely affects American exports to those third countries. So this will have a cascading effect downward. It may not start out that way, but if it continues and gets worse, it will have a big effect. And it also has effect on currencies. And when currencies start becoming volatile in response to trade frictions, then you have another set of problems, which really worries me, that if you can't control this and turn it around or stabilize it, it will cause deterioration. And politically, at some point, the pressures will grow. Particularly the farm community is already upset in the United States because supply chains, you can't turn them on and off like light switches.
Right.
Once you lose a supply relationship, if you're a farmer, a high-tech company, it's very hard to get them back. So the damage that's done is not just short-term cyclical, but long-term structural. And I think people, once they start understanding this, maybe there'll be a different dimension to the discussion in the United States. And politically, the president has held a lot of his base, but maybe they'll decide this is getting too risky and too much of a long-term disruption.
In the 2019 survey, Mr. Zhao, on the 5-year outlook for Chinese businesses in China, about 1 in 5 respondents said, these are foreign companies, they are optimistic, while 44% are somewhat optimistic. 1 in 5 are neutral, while the rest are somewhat optimistic and pessimistic. Well, these are the numbers showing over there on the screen. So, Mr. Zhao, how attractive still China will be? What does China have in hand and in heart that would be the most important factors for others to stay here and also prosper together?
I think you can interpret this message from two different perspectives. But most people will interpret it in a very optimistic way, because still over 60% of the respondents said that they are optimistic or about to optimistic. However, people on the other side, some people are looking pessimistic about China's economy, or interpret this and saying, oh, there's a growing number of people are turning pessimistic. But I would say there are two major points that's still supporting China's growth and making China a very attractive place for foreign investment. Number one is the size of the market. No need to say we have 1.4 billion people. You know, it's a very big market. And secondly, China it's a very young, vibrant, innovative world in which new technologies are coming out every day. So I think in this environment, and also the government policies are supporting this innovation and protecting IPR more and more. So I think in this environment, when you combine the size, the scale, and the innovation, you have a market looking forward that will be still very attractive to all the global business multinationals to come to this country.
We will see. Thank you so much, the three of you gentlemen. Zhao Hai, Anthony Chen, last but not least, Robert Hormats. Really appreciate it. Thank you.